In the year 2125, a century after humanity learned to fold space like a sheet of paper and crease two distant points together, a survey vessel called the Wanderlight drifted into a star system with an unremarkable sun and a single dark planet. By then, star travel had begun to feel ordinary to people who had grown up with it. There were navigation charts that treated light years the way ancient sailors once treated coastlines. There were shipping lanes through quiet gulfs, traffic advisories for regions of unpredictable gravity, seasonal cautions near newborn stars. The Wanderlight was small, careful, and habitually curious, which is to say, it was a good ship for finding something that had been waiting for a long time. The crew kept simple roles. Sarah Lane handled approach burns with the patience of someone who liked to get a thing exactly right the first time. Michael Hart kept the engineering decks humming and the hull listening. Daniel Brooks collected stories and contexts and could hold history the way a good archivist holds fragile glass. The ship's learning system, Grace, spoke when invited and otherwise listened, filing away patterns and silences. The mission lead and narrator for this account, Eleanor Ward, spent most days as a xenolinguist, someone who asks questions of things that may or may not know how to answer. From afar, the world looked like obsidian polished by tide. Up close, it resolved into continents carved with lines so fine they resembled handwriting in stone. Michael argued at first for geology, for ancient rivers or fault scarring or wind over eras, but the lines refused the chaos of weather. They held an even spacing, a repeating cadence, a syntax that felt deliberate in the way of a steady pulse. The planet turned beneath the Wanderlight without radio, without beacons, without so much as a storm. It was as if a night-black sphere had been set beside a modest star and then left to be read rather than visited. Descent required trust in instruments. Thin trace gases shimmered like dust. The land beneath looked unbroken until it accepted landing gear as a matter of fact. Under boots and pressure, the surface carried a muted vibration that translated to bones before it reached ears. It felt less like standing on ground and more like standing on the casing of a machine as it idled. For a long moment, the team simply stood and listened and let the strangeness reach them. Eleanor held a sensor plate against the surface and let it listen, then pressed her palm to the stone and allowed herself to notice the almost heartbeat. The instruments registered a persistent low frequency, threaded with harmonics that organized and reorganized along the carved lines that crossed the plane. It would have been easy to call the sensation eerie if it hadn't also felt like an invitation written in a language the body understood before the mind did. The crew followed a faint, luminous drift that gathered along the nearest trench of etching and flowed away toward a horizon of dark ridges. As they walked, the glow strengthened to a narrow river of pale gold running within the carved line, and the vibration beneath them met their footfalls with a subtle, almost conversational adjustment. The path led into a canyon whose floor had parted to reveal a basin shaped like a flower. The petals were platforms of black stone with edges that caught light. At the center stood a column the height of a house. It had the look of engineered glass that had forgotten it should be fragile. Grace recorded everything. The column woke in the presence of observers who brought pattern and curiosity. Rings near its base brightened, and what looked like inscribed characters began rearranging themselves in an orderly migration toward legibility. The crew had walked into an interface designed for minds that did not yet exist when it was built, and the interface had been patient enough to wait a very long time. The first response was not words, it was sequence. Within the air above the column, images formed in quiet layers. A sky appeared with two moons, one larger than the other, pacing each other like companions who had learned each other's steps. The planet, as it had been, showed itself in blues and soft greens. Cities spiraled inwards toward cool lakes, their streets curved and purposeful, their architecture balanced in a way that suggested a people who enjoyed symmetry but did not punish themselves with it. The makers had long, spring-lithe bodies and hair adorned with filaments that glowed like seeds of light. Their movements had a precision that belonged to dancers and engineers. The narrative carried itself forward without a voice. Seasons turned. Children learned patterns by tracing them with wet hands on stone that recorded and forgot as it was taught. Harvests followed the moons. Craftsmanship rose to an art that treated function and grace as aspects of the same intention. Structures, sunlight, the way a good instrument uses resonance, never wasting what the material could sing back. As Grace translated sequences into summaries, it became clear that this was not only a story of a people, but also a record of a planet, instructed to remember them. The moons betrayed that world with no malice. Over long scales, small tugs became great ones. Tides lengthened and shortened until lakes went to steam. Winds worked in harmonics that the cities could not absorb without splitting. The people did not panic. They convened in halls with ceilings designed to teach calm simply by existing. They braided their knowledge into a plan that would ask more of matter than most plans do. The images turned to diagrams. Around the system's sun, great mirror segments took their places one at a time, forming a ring that did not close. It was not a cage and not a sphere, but a kind of astronomical lens that learned to tilt and aim and concentrate. Light became both energy and instruction. With a slow, patient ritual, the mirrors poured shaped light onto the wounded planet. The ground learned to accept the pulse. The carved lines, the very lines now under human feet, were not decoration. They were conduits and scaffolds and rails for information, the nervous system of a world. Where the light touched, atmosphere thickened by molecules, and then by breath. Water returned from hoarded corners of the system, coaxed by gravity and light. Memory was written into the stone in redundancy, so that 1,000 small failures would never equal a single great loss. The people knew their time as they had been would end, and still they spent effort not on escape, but on return. They built an archive that could guide a world back toward habitability once the moon's quarrels settled. It would do so by remembering how, not by pretending nothing had happened. The column dimmed, then offered the basin a view of something closer, a skein of the bright lines running away from the canyon into every direction, coated with pulses that replicated and checked themselves and slowed and quickened to keep the whole pattern in health. The surface of the planet was a networked machine whose computation prioritized repair over conquest, regrowth over excess, and accuracy over spectacle. It was an engine built to hold a culture's ways without holding the culture itself captive to a single point in time. The crew worked in cycles. Michael mapped the frequency bands that carried control and those that carried story. Daniel cross-referenced the sequence of images with the known dynamics of binary moons and drew the sober conclusion that the chronology matched. Sarah watched the horizon and the distant points where the carved lines met, attentive to patterns that resembled traffic more than art. Grace extended a hand toward the column's translation lattice and slowed it gently until the rate of reveal matched human comprehension. Eleanor let the cadence of the planet teach her how to ask useful questions without speaking them out loud. 3 days passed. The Wanderlight circled like a careful bird, adjusting orbit as needed to maintain contact. The planet never rushed its guests, and in that steady welcome, the crew remembered an older human rhythm in which attention precedes understanding, and quiet is not the same as emptiness. On the 4th day, the basin revealed a second structure, a small distance away, not twin, but sibling. It had fewer rings and no film of images. Instead, it offered an austere surface with a single vertical trace of light that climbed at the pace of a calm clock. Grace recognized the pattern first. The column had entered a mode for choice. In the language of decision trees, it was a fork. The choice was old and relevant. The planet could provide 2 kinds of gifts. One gift was extraction. It could deliver a repository of technical schemas, games, rituals, and mirroring mathematics. A harvest that would travel well and make the visitors powerful quickly. The other gift was reciprocity. The planet could invite the visitors to add their own ways and stories to the archive, and, in exchange, grant a key tuned to what they had offered. The key would not open everything. It would open what the planet decided could be safely entrusted to a species that had just introduced itself with modesty and care. Eleanor understood the gravity of lawful theft, as scholars of rare things always do. Daniel experienced the weight of legacy. Michael toggled between maintenance instincts and the thrill of capability. Sarah measured the balance between homebound duty and the new responsibility of being seen by a witness older than all but the oldest human stories. Grace did what good systems do when they are told to serve people well. She waited until she was asked for counsel, then evaluated what choice would maintain the most futures for the most lives. The crew chose to contribute first. The column accepted the decision as if it had never expected any other answer, and yet appreciated having it spoken to the world. What followed was a ritual of offering without the crutch of spectacle. The crew described their species to the archive in careful segments that would be legible without apology or exaggeration. They taught the planet the way cities sound when rain remembers how to fall in a summer that has been too dry. They recorded the shape of a kindergarten lesson that taught cooperation with paper and mirrors. They offered the recipe for a bridge that bent in wind rather than fought it, and therefore survived it. They placed in the basin a slow section of a string quartet recorded in a kitchen one winter when the power had failed and breath hung in the air like words that had not learned how to speak yet. The archive accepted the gifts by distributing them along the lines in a pattern that looked similar to the way a tide rises along a rugged coast. The planet did not have hands, and yet it received as if it did. In the center of the smaller column, a pane lifted. Inside rested a seed the size of a small stone, dark, warm, unexpectedly heavy for its size. When Grace scanned it, she found on its surface a composite signature formed from the patterns the crew had just offered. The seed was a key with a condition. It would open pathways on this world and on a family of engineered archives elsewhere, but only when it heard two songs. The first song was the one the crew had already taught. The second was a song humanity had not written yet. The gift moved the center of gravity from the planet back to the Wonderlight. The crew returned to orbit with the seed carried in a storage field and the plane recorded in research drives. The first message home contained only an outline. There was an engineered planet acting as a restoration archive. There was evidence of stellar lensing with mirrors arranged as an incomplete ring. There were indications of ethics carved into bedrock and enforced by scale rather than law. Attached were translations sufficient to show the authenticity of the claim, and insufficient to allow the impatient to rush to theft. On the 8th day, as the Wanderlight prepped for fold, the planet did something small and generous. It adjusted the vibration under the landing site to match the rhythm of the crew's movements recorded over the first hour on the surface. That slight echo turned into a pattern that might someday be a song from the planet's perspective, a record of visitors who had come gently and left something of themselves without taking everything that could be carried. The fold home was long enough for reflection to become conclusion. The discovery would alter policy. It would alter education. It would alter the way people told stories about the future, which is one of the ways the future is shaped. Sarah centered the ship in a corridor of quiet space-time and thought about thresholds, and how often the sensible choice at a threshold is not to rush. Michael wrote maintenance notes in the manner of someone who knows that the ability to fix a thing can be as powerful as the ability to build a new one. Daniel drafted a brief that placed the planet within a history of custodial artifacts, libraries, seed vaults, lighthouses, and the rituals that keep all three awake across generations. Grace curated the crew's silence into a record of care. Eleanor thought about memory as a form that matter takes when it is asked to hold love for the absent. She assembled the planet's images into an order that could be told to school children who had never known a world without the possibility of stepping between stars. The story would begin by explaining that survival without generosity can feel a lot like failure, and that an archive built to be a tool for repair is not the same as a monument built to be looked at and then forgotten. It would explain that a key that waits for a song yet unwritten is a way to teach patience to those who want the world to move faster than wisdom. The reception on Earth unfolded in the predictable ways. There were requests for technical schemas pressed forward with the urgency of those who believe that speed is safety. There were petitions to restrict access pressed forward by those who believe that safety is scarcity. There were families who listened to the version for children and recognized in it a tone that sounded like hope without sentimentality. The seed sat in a field chamber in a museum that treated living things and knowledge as parts of the same commons, and the chamber was surrounded by a quiet that felt less like security and more like respect. Months turned into a year, marked by careful expeditions and a revision of star travel etiquette that added to the old rule about going gently. The new rule asked visitors to notice when a place was designed to learn from guests as much as to teach them. Reciprocity became a practiced reflex rather than an improvisation. Historians began to record where different ships had chosen to contribute before requesting instruction, and the maps of the known corridors through folded space acquired small markers that indicated not danger, but trust. The Wanderlight returned to the Black World with a second team and a cargo bay not of tools, but of gifts. There were poems shaped by schoolrooms that had taken the first story to heart. There were designs for water channels that whispered in wind so that walking near them at night taught people to rest. There were new chess variants and a vaccine primer and a set of exercises used by firefighters to build the habit of moving together. There were fragments of a song that had not quite finished arriving, pulled from 100 kitchens and buses and workshops where people had found themselves humming without quite knowing why. The planet continued to heal at its own speed. The carved lines slowly took on the subtle shine of material that had learned again to carry water within its channels. The air became a fraction thicker and carried a smell that was neither earth nor entirely alien, but belonged instead to the category called weather. The basin that had been shaped like a flower gathered dew that did not yet deserve to be called a pond. The mirrors around the star shifted minutely to account for new scattering in the slow-growing air, like a teacher adjusting the angle of a lamp by instinct. Eleanor walked the petal platforms again and understood that the greatest technology on the planet might have been restraint. The makers had chosen not to bind their heirs to a single answer. They had chosen to model repair over conquest and reciprocity over extraction. They had chosen to build an instrument that anyone could play who could be patient. They had taught the world to remember in a way that could make room for others to be legible within it. The seed waited for its second song. Composers tried and failed to trick it with imitations. Scientists tried and failed to brute force the interface. The failure did not feel like humiliation. It felt like a question asked kindly. In the meantime, the existence of the seed changed the way Earth listened to itself. Cities invited night again so that people could hear distance without the roar of excess. Schools evaluated projects not only by outcomes, but by the quality of attention brought to a problem. Workshops built instruments that required 2 players to sound at all. Couples wrote vows that included the phrase, "We will repair." The 3rd year after discovery, the first true rain fell on the planet. It happened at night. There was no lightning and no wind against the hulls of the modest buildings the expedition had grown out of cargo cases. The drops arrived one by one, with the concentration of someone laying out a meal for a guest long expected. The carved lines through the plain accepted the water and directed it with the economy of a good river delta. The basin flower cup cupped its hands and held what it was given. The crew stood under the ship's lights and let a few drops pattern their sleeves, then stepped back, unwilling to take even that small resource away from a world practicing itself. When the sunrise came, it showed a ground that had moved infinitesimally from black to something that considered green. The column brightened as if pleased without needing to be. The second column surfaced a pattern that resembled a heartbeat, slowed by sleep, but ready to quicken when conditions called for it. Grace, listening to the ground as she always did when it had something to say, observed that the planet had begun to treat the visiting crew as part of its model of weather. Presence and breath and heat and motion had joined wind and sun and geometry in the archive's accounting. There are many ways to measure the success of a mission. You can count the new schematics in the open libraries, or the changes to policy, or the number of times a student's eyes widen when shown a picture of a mirror catching starlight like rain. You can count repaired bridges, replanted hillsides, recalibrated traffic systems. Eleanor preferred another metric that did not reduce to integers. She asked whether, after the story of the planet had been told, people wanted more to take or to tend. Over years, the balance shifted toward tending, not perfectly and not everywhere, but enough that one could say the human world had learned a new reflex. In the 10th year, a wave of sound spread across Earth and out along the corridors people traveled to work among stars. It did not originate from a stage or an anthem, but from an accumulation of small melodies that had found each other. People whistled while setting bread. Mechanics sang under their breath while restoring a tram line in a city that had nearly forgotten how to move. Children timed their skipping to a rhythm taught in classrooms named for rivers rather than soldiers. The recordings reached the seed not as a single performance, but as a chorus of ordinary lives. The key warmed in its chamber and unlocked with a sound that resembled relief. The planet accepted the second song with a patience that honored the time it had taken to arrive. New layers of the archive opened not as a flood, but as a tide that kept pace with comprehension. The gift that came first was not a weapon, and not a map to a mine, and not a way to command the mirrors. The gift was a set of instructions for how to teach apprentices in a world that has learned to hurry. It offered exercises that build patience the way a bridge builds load-bearing, one fiber at a time. It described games that use attention as currency and awarded victory not to speed, but to those who notice what will matter next. It explained how to make structures that accept change without breaking, and how to invite strangers to contribute to a pattern without degrading it. In the 20th year, lakes returned to the Black Planet with the quiet authority of memory reclaimed. Fern-like growths experimented with soil that had been instructed gently in how to be soil again. The mirrors around the star adjusted as if in conversation with the new chemistry of the air. The carved lines continued to shine, not as symbols of a wound, but as the living veins of a patient that had changed its diet and found its balance again. The Wanderlight grew old in good service and rotated out to become a museum of careful work, and a newer ship with a different name took over the patient route. People asked over and over what to call the world. Names carry obligations. The crew resisted the habit of naming a place for the first ones who wrote it down in a ledger. In the end, the planet named itself by being what it was. The language of the archive had a term that translated best as the place that remembers in order to repair. That was sufficient. It felt right to let a world be its function rather than a trophy on a list. By the time 30 years had passed, the story had settled into an ordinary miracle. The star lanes still carried cargo at velocity. New mistakes continued to be made, because that is what living systems do when they try to learn. But the existence of an elder world that had chosen to teach repair changed the temperament of the species that had met it. It gave people a way to measure wealth in units other than accumulation. It offered a different image to the children who looked up. Not a fortress and not a throne, but a patient engine that turned light into memory and memory into gentleness. The final image for this episode is simple. A lake reflects a pale star in the early morning on a world that once cracked and then taught itself how to heal. On the shore stand markers that are not fences and not flags. They are instruments that listen for newcomers, walking with the careful tread of guests who understand the old rule about going anywhere and doing so gently. The air holds a trace of water and a trace of stone and a trace of the simple salt that skin leaves when it dries. The carved lines hum to themselves like a teacher reading in another room. The planet keeps its lessons in order. The visitors keep their hands at their sides until invited. The mirrors at the edge of the system tilt infinitesimally to follow a winter sun. Somewhere far away, on a blue world that is now a little more patient than it used to be, a child falls asleep to a story about a place that remembers in order to repair. And that is the story of how, 100 years after star travel became possible, humanity found a planet full of ancient technology that knew how to mend what time had undone, and how the encounter mended us in ways we had not thought to ask for.